Hello and good afternoon from Northern Virginia. I am here with Stephen Molter, our solutions architect at IntelliGRC, where we are simplifying continuous compliance. Today we are looking to open some questions that we've been hearing from the defense industrial base, specifically about the cybersecurity maturity model certification proposed rule. This was a recent update just before the holidays. All of us wishing for that for Christmas got what we wanted. So with that, I'm James Norris. I'm simply hosting and asking questions to our solutions architect, Steve Molter. I'll give him a minute to introduce himself.
Yeah, I'm Stephen Molter. I love this stuff, and yeah, I'm a solutions architect here at IntelliGRC. Been here for a few years now, and yeah, today is one of those days that we really want to focus on helping laymen and people who don't have the time and answer some of those conversations and questions that have arisen from especially the proposed rule that just dropped. So that's really what we're going to be going over. And again, yes, this is opinion. This is my fallible interpretation and my fifth grade reading level or whatever it is. And yeah, I just want to make sure that we're on the same page, but helpful to the people that we really do want to focus on helping.
Most of us don't get to the second page of a DFARS clause until we've hit at least the 10th grade reading level. Yeah. So with that, let's go ahead and open the first question, which is all of the defense industrial base contractors getting stuff together for their system security plan and their plan of action and milestones. They're probably allowed to keep some of those items on their plan of action and milestones or POAMs. Is that the case? Are things POAMable still?
Yeah, so there are POAM eligibility, right? Obviously, we don't recommend kind of coming at it with the mindset of waiting till the last minute to do things. But when it comes to the POAM timeline requirements, it really does depend on when your certification assessment took place or your self-assessment took place and what level the certification is being required by the contract. So for right off the bat, the rule is very clear. The proposed rule is very clear. There is no allowance of POAMs for level 1, right? All 15 of the requirements to protect FCI data under CMMC level 1 apply, and you're not allowed to have a gap. If you're going to be eligible for those level 1 contracts, right, you have to have all of those implemented with no POAMs. But for level 2, they did clarify the POAM requirements. This is something we knew was coming. We just didn't know what the extent of the restrictions were going to be. And so now we know, you can have level 1 pointer POAM items, right? So in the SPURS system, according to the DoD assessment methodology, now is called the CMMC assessment or scoring methodology. Those 1 pointers are allowed to be POAM, except for a few that they lay out specific 1 pointers that cannot be POAM'd. So if it's a 1 pointer and it's not one of those exceptions, you can POAM it, and you have 180 days, essentially 6 months, from the time you either have that self-assessment or that C3PAO assessment for them to come back and verify that you've closed out all of those POAM items. And that period that you have that POAM open, you'll have that 180-day period, you'll have this conditional certification, right? But once they verify that has all been closed out, they update SPURS/EMAS, depending on whether you're an OSA or an OSC, OSA being the self-assessment organization versus the OSC organization seeking certification. Regardless, once that's updated in the official channels, then you'll have that final certification or final compliance is what they're calling it for organization seeking assessment. But, regardless, if you don't close out those POAM items within that 180 days, that conditional status, whether it's an actual certification assessment or self-assessment, that conditional status of compliance expires. And if it expires, when you have a contract that required it, but you came into the contract with a POAM, then they will take the normal means of you not living up to your end of the bargain when it comes to a government contract, and they will exercise their rights to do so. So yes, it's very important to close out those POAMs and not wait to the last minute, and try to not have as many POAMs as possible when you come into your assessment.
Yeah, so you want to you want to be ahead of the curve on that for even being eligible to win those contracts, because your competitors are going to be bragging about their CMMC certifications if they have them. So if you are one of those very few defense industrial based companies that is waiting to the last minute, you have 180 days to satisfy these 1-point controls. So you at least need to start with all of the other scored items on your POAM, on your SSP. So even if you're procrastinating, you should be making some progress, showing some maturity. And according to the contracts you've already won historically, you should already have your SPURS score uploaded.
Yep. And you'll need to update, in accordance with making sure it's only 1-pointers, because before SPURS scores were heavily affected by people not doing things like MFA and other things like that.
Those are some of the easy ones that you can do now from some of the tools you have natively, likely. All right.
Likely, yeah.
So the whole FedRAMP moderate equivalency has stopped us up from the beginning. People want to know what the clarification is. What is FedRAMP moderate equivalent? Who does it apply to?
Yeah, so we kind of did get some clarification from the proposed rule. Again, second reminder of the talk, right? It's a proposed rule. This could all change. And I assume that certain things will change, right? So we kind of did and kind of didn't get clarification, mainly due to what happened kind of shortly after the proposed rule dropped. We also had that memo from the DoD CIO drop as well, where there's some obvious contradictions, or at least assumed contradictions between what's proposed in the rule, right, the CMMC proposed rule, and this memo. And so within DFAR 7012, just some backstory, there's this reference to DFAR 7010. That's where we get the cloud SRG requirements. Really quickly wanted to state that, CMMC rule is very clear. The proposed rule is very clear that has nothing to do with CMMC. It does not apply. But what does apply is what we all know applies. The DFAR 7012 is already there. It's already showing up in contracts, and it already references this idea of equivalency. And so the problem comes in is where this DoD CIO memo actually references the DFAR 7012 that already exists, not what's coming with the CMMC final rule. So we know that the CIO's memo is already available and applicable, right? So what it states are things like that the cloud service provider's service offering, in order for it to be equivalent. And this is if it doesn't have an ATO, if it's not gone through the FedRAMP moderate process to be authorized and show up on the marketplace, things like that. If it wants to reach equivalency, that service offering has to be 100%, according to the memo, 100% compliant with the FedRAMP moderate security controls baseline. And it also has a bunch of really specific documentation requirements. So we can always go over it, and you can see all over LinkedIn the comments about it. And you can read the memo. It's just got a lot of very specific requirements above and beyond what we see in the CMMC proposed rule. So the other thing is, obviously, because there's 100% compliant requirements there for those 853 moderate baseline controls that apply to FedRAMP, there's no POAMs allowed for that CSP to meet the equivalency in this memo. So it's really kind of strict. It's almost if you know anything about the ATO process for FedRAMP or any RMF process for that matter, POAMs are very common, right? And some shops are better than other shops in getting those POAMs addressed, and maybe this is one of the reasons why the DoD CIO is being so strict here. But POAMs are very common, and one of the big complaints in the industry right now is obviously no ATO really has ever had a perfect slate, right? Everybody has POAMs, and so it's kind of tone deaf. And it's in direct contradiction with what we see in the proposed rule that states if a CSP is being used to transmit, process, and store CUI, and I'll take a second here to clarify something. The proposed rule, one of the caveats and one of the areas that we need clarification is it says it only mentions CUI when it comes to the FedRAMP requirements for CSPs, right? So it doesn't mention anything about this concept regarding security protection data, right? But anyway, the proposed rule says if a CSP is transmitting, processing, storing, CUI, then that CSP must either have an authorization, right, a FedRAMP moderate or higher authorization, or it has to meet the security requirements equivalent to that found in the FedRAMP moderate. And then it goes on to clarify what equivalency means. So it says that the contractor, the customer, and the OSC, the OSA working on the contract that has these requirements, these CMMC requirements, that contractor needs to obtain from the cloud service provider an SSP and some other other documentation, it says, that talks about the environment, its responsibilities, and how the cloud service provider is detailing out its status against those baseline controls. But it also allows the contractor to have a CRM, a customer responsibility matrix, that summarizes how each of the controls are being met. But it also allows essentially for the customer to be responsible to implement what the CSP doesn't. And this is one of the contradictions between the CMMC rule and the DoD CIO memo, is that in order for equivalency to be met according to the CIO's memo, it says that the CSP alone, it doesn't allow for the contractor to meet any of the requirements. It says that the CSP has to be 100% compliant on its own with no POAMs, right? So it's very odd the way that they address it. And it's one thing to note is the proposed rule gives us a kind of challenging definition, and that's really being heavily discussed about what actually constitutes something being an external service provider versus a cloud service provider, or what that means in their relationship. I'm in conversations right now. You'll see it on LinkedIn if you follow me, that we're talking about. It looks to some like the DoD is really trying to bifurcate the two, to really differentiate the two, whereas to others it looks like CSP is just a sub definition under the overarching umbrella term of ESP, or external service provider. And it does clarify that an ESP is really only an ESP in CMMC's eyes if this ESP stores, processes, or transmits CUI or security protection data.
Yeah, security protection data. What is it and why does it matter?
Yeah, exactly. So security protection data, we saw it in some linked scoping documents and whatnot that were accidentally published. But the scoping idea of CMMC environment and scope is now really not just affected by CUI, because that's kind of been the whole point, is protecting and safeguarding CUI, and it still is. But now we have this other type of data that kind of now affects our how we implement requirements, and it's this security protection data concept. It doesn't really have a honed-in definition. We see it come out of kind of nowhere, other than obviously if you saw the leaked documents, but it's not really honed in. And so we here at IntelliGRC are taking a really conservative approach to this concept, right? The examples that they give in the rule when they mention the security protection data asset that then, by definition, implicates external service providers into the CMMC scope and requires external service providers other than a cloud service provider to actually have a CMMC level 2 certification. The two examples that they give when they mention this security protection data concept is log data and configuration data. And so to be conservative and to be safe, and try to in our have due diligence and our best efforts for you guys, As far as we can tell, security protection data is really any data about the system or assets within the system that, if it was compromised, could lead to a CUI asset or CUI data being put at further risk, right? So, the other examples kind of that we've thought of, and this is the reason why I say we're kind of being more conservative, because it's obviously not laid out this way in the rule. This is something we need to get clarification about. But the other examples we've come up with is like system diagrams and like CUI data flow diagrams, right? Where you're seeing a visualized representation of how CUI flows throughout your environment. Baseline configuration documents is a huge one, right? And penetration testing results, all these different things that are, we know that if these documents, although they're not CUI, right? You don't mark them as CUI, right? But if that information was compromised, then those assets and that have CUI on them and store, process, transmit CUI, and that data itself, we really think could be at risk of being compromised. And we really truly do believe that that is the concept behind this security protection data, as well as because it's kind of synonymous with that idea of security protection assets, right? That's why those assets, although they're not CUI assets, they are they have all the same requirements as applicable that the CUI assets do, because if those assets are compromised, then it leads to risk for CUI assets, and those assets do protect those CUI assets. So we're kind of taking that same approach and being careful not to not take it seriously enough. Again, it really is all about protecting CUI still. And the proposed rule requires that ESPs that transmit this CUI and those security protection data types must have a CMMC level 2 final certification, right? So regardless of whether they're a contractor that is going for a self-assessment, right? This is one of the other concerning things, is whether they're going for a self-assessment and they're eligible for a CMMC level 2 self-assessment, or if they are actually required under that contract to go for a C3PAO certification assessment. Regardless of that, the ESP that they're using at CMMC level 2 has to actually have a full certification assessment done and have that certification, which is crazy to me, because you're thinking about flow down requirements, you're thinking about all these ideas of equivalency and whatnot, and it kind of seems a little bit rigid to have a self-assessment required contractor require their ESP to have an actual full certification assessment. But that's my 2 cents on that. One thing, just to wrap up this relationship between the CSPs and the ESPs concept, is this kind of, again, brings back that concern about how CSPs are going to be affected by security protection data. Again, it doesn't mention within the rule that CSPs have that same obligation. It literally, when it talks about CSPs, it literally only mentions CUI data specifically, and that's how it implicates those CSPs into the FedRAMP requirements. So, it's something we're going to have to get clarification on, and if the same logic follows that security protection assets have the same CUI CMMC requirements, right, for CUI assets, then I think it follows that the FedRAMP requirements for CUI assets that are CSPs will also have, if they are storing, processing, or transmitting security protection data, it could go the direction of requiring them to have those same FedRAMP requirements that the CUI cloud assets will have. So something really to consider and look out for.
So a lot of the organizations working with the defense industrial base and those within it are looking to limit their exposure to any type of information that's going to make them do more with their information security posture. So eventually it's going to hit everybody. Like CMMC is focusing on the DIB right now, but we're seeing similar frameworks pop up between interstate commerce, between inter countries. You've got GDPR. So these regulations are hitting each organization at some point. Every business that's doing any exposure online is going to need to meet requirements. But in the meantime, what can we do to limit our exposure to the CUI flowdown, specifically when it's unnecessary CUI flowdown from our primes? How can we limit our exposure to that?
Yeah, I mean, so in regards to like the proposed rule and what it talks about, honestly, that question really isn't answered. In fact, it's kind of made worse. They really doubled down on this idea of forcing the contractor to kind of flow down everything. And maybe worse is not the right word. I mean, data is data. Data that is needing protection is data that is needing protection, right? So if it does get flowed down in that way, and you're a subcontractor that understands that the contract that they're working on has these same requirements and they flow down those requirements, then yeah, it makes sense. But it's definitely much clearer that the DoD is very serious about making sure that all the way down the supply chain, the requirements that apply to protecting CUI apply to protecting CUI, right, all the way down.
Even the mom and pop shop that doesn't even have computers and everything's in filing cabinets. If CUI lands on their desk, they have to be capable of receiving it.
Yeah, I mean, if they get handed CUI that they're not on a contract that they agreed to having these stipulations and they weren't, under any obligation to protect CUI, there was no anticipation of them, getting CUI, things like that, then that's definitely a place where they need to go to their prime, right, or go to the CO, however the relationship works, and like really express what's going on and do whatever they can to get CUI out of their hands. But if they've engaged in a contract, they've knowingly engaged in a contract that had the same stipulations about protecting CUI, DFAR 7012, 7019, 7020, and then here the revision to 7021, then yeah, they're going to have to protect CUI because that's the requirement. So yes.
The greater majority of the defense industrial base has been accepting these contracts without questioning what they're supposed to be doing with the information, and they were happy to receive the money. They don't have a case to go back to the prime and say, hey, stop sending me this stuff. But if you hired a lawyer early on and said, I don't want any of the CUI touching my environment, then you might have a case.
Yeah, you just don't bid on contracts, solicitations that have those requirements. It's obvious the contracts that have the requirements. It's just sometimes you do get handed things that you don't need, and it's a common complaint in the industry. And that's where you put on your big boy pants and go talk to the person you need to talk to, and not just let it happen. Right? You need to address it.
It's better to have these conversations today and know what to expect. So
yeah,
another thing that we're seeing with a lot of the defense industrial bases, how can we apply all of our controls as non-applicable? Like, what can we get away with saying this doesn't apply to me?
Yeah, that's a funny way to say it, because I came into the writing some of my notes for this concept, not really thinking about it that way. More thinking about, people have a misunderstanding. But yeah, I would also see that happens sometimes too. So really, some back history, we under the DFAR 7012, and then subsequently when we had the assessment requirements in 7019 and 20 come out, we had this document. It's a very outdated document. It's not been updated since June of 2020, I believe it says on the top of the document. We had this document called the DoD assessment methodology, and this was addressed in that 7019. It's directly referenced there. But this idea of not applicability was, in my opinion, better addressed there than in the proposed rule, right? So, or at least more clearly addressed there. Maybe not better. Maybe what we're seeing now with discretion of the C3PAO and the organization being able to justify themselves, which I'll get to, maybe that is better. But the point is it was much more specific in the DoD assessment methodology, or the DODAM. But really, what we see in the new rule is kind of we see the term not applicable being defined, but we kind of then just see nothing more. Whereas, in the DODAM, we had like a couple controls. I think it was 3 controls that they specifically say, that they might not have this technology in their environment. So the evaluator, they use the term evaluator, is not to subtract points for their from their SPUR score for these items if they didn't have the controls implemented or they marked NA or non-implemented. Then if they have, obviously with the conditions that they have policies and procedures to address that aspect of their environment. For example, wireless access, all the controls related to wireless access, if they didn't have Wi-Fi access points in their environment and in their scope, then they're not to lose points, but they have to make sure they have a policy and procedure to address, users can't bring a wireless access, a TP-Link or a Realtek wireless access point from Walmart and plug it into a Cat 6 cable in the wall, right? Like they can't add wireless access points. And so you need to have policies and procedures to make sure that things don't come online that then make that an applicable control, right, within your environment. But yeah, you weren't supposed to lose points for that. Well, in the proposed rule, they kind of just define NA and they kind of leave it at that. Where and on top of that, they also add this weird concept where they in their definition of NA, they say the security requirement, it's a security requirement and or an objective, right? So most of us know by now that CMMC assessments are done at an assessment objective level, right? You don't just have the NIST 800-171 controls, right? You have all the objectives, at least currently, from the NIST 800-171 alpha document that has all the sub-objectives, right? And so all those objectives have to be met in order for the overarching requirement to be met. Well, in this proposed rule, they say, when they define not applicable, they say a security requirement and or objective that does not apply at the time of the CMMC assessment. And it almost seems that without any of the context from what we have in precedent from the DODAM, the DoD assessment methodology, it's almost like any requirement and or sub-objective could be marked as an A. And so it's like, we're really going to need clarification on whether there are specific ones or other ones that the DoD, other than obviously the ones that the DoD CIO specifically adjudicates as being acceptable, as being not applicable, right? We're really going to need clarification as to whether they're going to specify ones that are allowed to be considered not applicable, like they did in the DoD assessment methodology. And we're also going to need some clarification on this objective level versus overarching requirement level NA status, right, for things, because they don't make it clear. They kind of skip that whole concept in the proposed rule. We really don't have much to go right now, and this is one of those comments that I'm going to be submitting so that hopefully we can gain some clarity. And kind of just to wrap up this concept, our recommendation, or at least mine, right, is regarding this NA concept, there's a misunderstanding, and I kind of just went over it. There's a misunderstanding that if it doesn't feel like it applies to you, that then it's not applicable, right? Whereas under the DoD assessment methodology and the precedents that we have right now, remember, it's a proposed rule, it's not official yet, so we're still under the old system, right? There was this misunderstanding that you could feel this way, but under the DoD assessment methodology, there were specific ones that were approved with policies and procedures, mitigating the risks of them becoming applicable. That there were specific ones that could be marked as not applicable, not any one that you feel doesn't make sense for you, right? Like, no, unless the DoD CIO specifically responds to a request for one being considered not applicable, there are only specific ones that you can consider as not applicable. And on the SSP, in our experience through, for example, like a JSVA journey with a C through PAO for some of our clients, they don't want it to show up as not applicable. They want you to mark it as implemented, those requirements as implemented, and be very sure that you have policies and procedures, like I said, to show that you're mitigating the risks of your infrastructure, adding things that would make those controls applicable. So that's really all we have for that concept of NA. We've got a lot of clarification to get, but it's very tricky.
Okay, so we cannot just say that these controls are not applicable to my organization because I said so and hand it to a C3PAO like Kyrie Solutions. We would probably be told to come back when we're ready.
Right. Like you see under the new scoping guidance that, for example, when it comes to like the out of scope assets concept, there's a table that they give you. You see that they updated it in this iteration for the proposed documentation and the proposed rule. You see them specifically say, be ready to justify that this is an out of scope asset. I think it's going to be the same concept. Be ready to justify that something's not applicable and then have those policies and procedures in place.
That makes sense to me. And that is the last question that we had for today. So in closing, again, these are what we believe are professional opinions of the things closest to fact that we could find. There are still some gray areas, but yep. As part of a community that thrives off of feedback, we would love to hear from you. If you want to speak with us, we are happy to debate how we came to the conclusions that we have. Steve loves doing that. I'm happy to moderate, or I could disappear. But I thank you for your time, Steve, and I think everybody that's tuned into this, you're the best part of this. So send some questions in and let us know what you're talking about, and so we can talk about it too.
Thanks, guys.